I want to talk about what this might mean for politics and kind of society more generally. So I'm joined by Ross Kaminsky, libertarian talk show host on 630 KHOW, and Elisabeth Epps, who's a progressive legal advocate with the Denver Justice Project. Elisabeth, is this effective?
The disruptions? It's going to be. Part of the answer why it's effective is we're talking about it. And not too many people I know who are thinking folks are deluded into thinking the issue is really the disruption itself. If they are, we should talk more about that, right? Why they're effective is they're getting people having these conversations about what should be comfortable and what shouldn't. And a lot of folks, myself included, think that a country like ours that doesn't provide a guaranteed right to an education or a guaranteed right to clean water, that folks who are in an administration that is okay with those things not being rights would assert that someone has a right to a peaceful dinner is a little bit laughable, right? We're not interrupting casual Trump voters' homes on a Sunday afternoon having their family dinner. We're talking to the men and women, or in this case, Sarah Sanders and Secretary Nielsen, who are the women who are deputized to craft and enforce incredibly harmful policies. So absolutely, reaching out to interrupt them in spaces where they think they're safe, it's effective.
It is extremely effective. It's going to be the thing that causes Republicans to probably keep the House in November and Donald Trump to win re-election if he runs in 2020. It's the most effective thing that could be done to help Republicans. It's really remarkably short-sighted on the part of the far left to just show themselves as petty and angry and really willing to make politics more personal than I think most Americans want it to be. I really think that's the risk here. I think moderates in this country are going to look at what is going on, not just the Sarah Sanders thing, but they're going to, one thing after another that we've seen in recent days, and say, you know what, that's just inappropriate, and I don't want to side with those people.
I get how these interruptions invigorate people who are upset with the Trump administration, but do you think that they change minds? Do you think they sway anybody, or is that not the point?
I think it could kind of cut either way, right? If I could respond just briefly to one of the things you said, I admit I agree with a lot of that. One thing you said, though, that was problematic is that word petty. The idea that confronting someone in a place where they think safe, a person who is actively committing and perpetrating a harm, that confronting them on it is petty, is problematic to me. It can certainly serve to invigorate. I'm not, in this moment, as concerned about the distribution, the makeup, rather, of the House of Representatives this year and the coming year. But in terms of doing something that's going to interrupt what's happening to children and families on the border, yes, I think that it matters. And I think that while you asked, is it just going to invigorate versus it going to affect change? Well, we've seen some meaningful change in the past week. Hasn't been nearly enough, right? Dialing back, if you have a terrible, terrible policy and you make it a little superficially less terrible, I don't know if that's progress, but it's not in the wrong direction. So it's twofold. It both invigorates, but it also is claiming back space, this idea of civility, as if that's a norm. None of this is normal. It is not normal to take children from a mother's breast at a border. That's not normal. And so the idea that the responses to it should be a politely worded, stern letter is laughable.
I'm curious, though, Russ, what you think about, is this a tactic that you could see people on the right ever taking? I mean, haranguing people. You think about all the vitriol that's out there. I have no doubt that when Secretary Hillary Clinton goes out to dinner, that she occasionally gets some lock-her-up heckler.
Yeah, I don't want to say never, and I don't claim to speak for the right. We haven't yet seen it to this degree on the right and on this scale. What I see happening is I see Donald Trump kind of lowering the level of national discourse by a notch or two. And then a lot of these Democrats coming along, whether we're talking about the owner of the restaurant or Peter Fonda or whoever's heckling Nielsen and Miller and all these people, and just saying, well, how low can we go, right? And they'll say, I see your President Trump, I'll see you're lowering it a notch or two, and I'll lower it 10 or 20 more. You asked, will people's minds be changed? I think the only people whose minds will be changed are people who are in the middle. And I think this will really push them to want to back up Trump and Trump supporters, not because they like him or them, but because they feel like they're being treated unfairly. And I do think it is petty to go after someone in a restaurant when they're out to dinner with their family, even if you don't like what they do for a living.
Is there any separation for a public person into a private space or a public space where they have an expectation of privacy? I remember talking about when protesters were outside Cory Gardner's house out in Yuma in the middle of the night shouting at him. And I went on TV and I said, I think that's a line too far. Is there any line where we say, you know what, this may be a public person, but they're entitled to some modicum of private space?
Of course there are, right? We have laws and statutes that affect that, right? So not too far from here, when protesters were taking the streets outside of then District Attorney Morrissey's house, they did it during hours that were legally permissible and at a decibel volume level that was legally permissible. They used chalk, not permanent state rate. We have these things in place, but we have to back up to say, you said the Republicans haven't taken it to this level, as if our last president didn't endure banana peels, things like this thrown at him or said about his wife. I don't think that there should be a race to a bottom in terms of the level of discourse, but I also think it's really reductionist and overly simplistic to talk about Democrats in this space, because from what I've heard, the Democrats are incredibly complicit in the current crisis, if I could say it that way. I've heard Axelrod and Senator Booker and other folks talking about civility as if they're too calling for it. So it's overly simplistic to suggest that the people who are taking back spaces are doing so under the name of a Democrat banner. One other point, though,
sure.
Just when we talk about, is there a safe space? The unmitigated goal of Secretary Nielsen to be in a Mexican restaurant, it feels staged almost, like a setup. And for her to go into a place where workers are black and brown people, or for Press Secretary Sanders to be in Lexington, Virginia, in a place where workers have expressed to their manager that they don't feel safe. If there are safe spaces, the restaurants aren't part of that, right? Maybe your church, maybe certainly your home, place of worship, your child's school.
So what are the chances that this could ever happen locally? And would turnabout be fair play? I mean, I think there's a decent chance that if you were to poll Mile High, that Mayor Hancock's sanctuary stage would be pretty unpopular. If he got publicly shamed and booed out of a football game by a bunch of NFL fans who don't like his politics, is that acceptable, or does it have to? Where do you draw the line?
I think that when people are out doing things that are just part of your normal daily life, I think we should be able to consider that a safe space, a term I really don't like very much. I don't like the idea of saying we need to limit safe spaces, okay, to your home and this thing and that thing. You're out with your kids having dinner. You're at the football game, whatever it is. I really do understand the argument that when people think that a politician is doing something very wrong or an administration is doing something wrong, they want to stand up against it. But I think when you talk to the broad middle of the country and the people who are going to decide elections in Colorado and elsewhere, they really want politics kept away from their daily lives, from the things they enjoy all the time. And I wouldn't like to see Mayor Hancock booed out of a football game. But to answer your question directly, I can't rule it out. But I think Colorado is, I've lived a lot of places. I think Colorado is more polite than most. I think it's a little less likely here than some other places.
Wouldn't you say, though, the people that don't want to be confronted by protests in public, I mean, those are people for whom their daily life and limb is not dictated by political issues. I mean, it seems like it's a comfortable thing to say. I don't want to be confronted by politics except for when I choose to opt into it.
Well, there's one thing to say, I don't want to hear a discussion or something like that, but there's another thing to say, an individual person is going to be harassed in public because of who she happens to work for. I think most people would see that as a step too far.
So it's not who she happens to work for, right? In the case of Sarah Sanders, it's what she happens to say on a daily basis, right?
She's not the White House chef. I mean, she's a policy person.
This is a difference.
Right, but the people who did that to her said that it was because of who she works for.
I think if you drilled on their further comments, they were making a soundbite, but they were aware of who she was. They weren't addressing the White House chef in that way. Just to be clear, though, so yours is a tough question because I'm not in a position where I'm going to be defending the mayor in a lot of spaces, so accidentally agreeing again. But Ross, you are so right when you say these folks don't want to be confronted with it. We get that, and that's why they need to be, right? Protest is supposed to be uncomfortable. It is supposed to be disruptive. That is absolutely part and parcel. I would disagree, though, when you say that these swaths of, because you use one of those things that's just a code word for white people. When you say middle America, what you mean is white people who don't have to be confronted with certain, or who can choose to not have to face certain issues, that they're going to decide elections. In Colorado, we have a primary election tomorrow, right? I think that folks who are inclined to do so and for whom it's important should bother to vote. They should also be really aware that voting is neither necessary nor sufficient to be engaged. And we who prioritize freedoms and progress did not vote our way out of slavery, did not vote our way into having the right to vote, right? Did not vote to end Jim Crow. And so when I hear you talking about, to the extent it's ended, and when I hear you talking about people's discomfort and how uncomfortable it makes them feel, it makes me think that if we were having this conversation a few decades ago, that folks would say that, Bull Connor, he really should be allowed to eat in peace, right? That someone who's leading a charge of harming Black and brown Americans and queer people should be left alone because it's dinner time. I hope a lot of us would look back and think that's absurd.
Is all protest virtuous then?
Now that's, the philosopher in me loves the question. The short answer, I'd go with no, but that all protest could be.
Okay, because I think this is where some people who I think support the idea of protest just say haranguing somebody at dinner, especially if they're not trolling by going to a Mexican restaurant. If they're someplace else, that might be where the line is. Do we have an issue though, where of all of the past administrations, this one is in no position to call for civility?
I think that's probably true. But I also think that's part of the reason that it's a political mistake for Democrats to, as I said, call Trump and raise him. I think the being uncivil thing is quite a negative for President Trump, especially among female voters. And when so many people on the left, and I'll grant you, not all necessarily Democrats, but people who don't like Trump, whether they're Democrats or not, go out and do the kind of things like Peter Fonda's tweets calling for, well, I won't even say what he called for, it's just bad. And these other things that are being done every day now to Trump administration folks. I just think we've gone too far, and I do think it's simply not going to work. I also want to address one thing that Elisabeth said. You said when I was talking about the great middle of America that it was code for white people, which is interesting. And I want to agree and disagree in a way, as we often do. It is white people, but it's not because it's code for white people. It's mostly white people because over 90% of Black people vote Democrat. So when I talk about the middle of the country, I'm talking about people whose votes could potentially go one way or the other, and I don't see that as a very large factor in the Black community. So this isn't something about privilege or race per se. It's just that Blacks tend to vote Democrat. So the issue when you're talking about swing voters doesn't apply to Blacks as much.
Can I ask you to parse something? Just this is for the people who are watching this on YouTube or on our Facebook page. I hear you use the term, middle America, and I think you might statistically be correct that they're predominantly white, maybe even for the reason that you say, because in minority communities there's so much party hegemony. But isn't there also not this automatic virtue that's installed on this idea of like middle America, that these people are for some reason, they're working harder and they're more representative of the American ideal?
There is a lot of that put out there, and I don't buy into it. I don't think that middle America, whatever that means, or the working man, or whatever that means, is any more virtuous or any less virtuous than anybody else. And in fact, in some policy areas where these middle Americans voted for President Trump because of some of his economic views, let's say on trade, which I think are incredibly harmful, I think there's a lot of negative there. But the bottom line is, in many states, including Colorado, the unaffiliated outnumber either the Republicans or the Democrats, and those are the Republicans are going to vote Republican, the Democrats are going to vote Democrat, and the elections are going to be decided by people like me who are unaffiliated, and perhaps like you. And so that's why when I talk about this middle America thing, it's not to put them up on a platform, but rather to say that in politics, as in many things in life, what's really important is what changes. And the Democrats are not changing from voting Democrat. And I don't mean to be pointing at you. I know you're not a Democrat. And Republicans just moving left, just moving to my left, and then moving to my right. The Republicans are going to vote Republican. So the point I'm trying to make is purely a political one.
But this emphasis, though, on voting, again, elections have consequences that are, I think, undeniably important, but they're not the arbiter of social change. They're not the thing that is going to fix any particular social issue. If anything, elections catch up to change that has happened. So I feel like when we're constantly, I am unaffiliated as well, and I am participating in this primary. I'm leaving most of the blanks, no selection, voting on a couple of them, that to pretend that my act of doing that is somehow more or less virtuous or important than the brave folks who are encountering Secretary Sanders or Secretary Nielsen during their meal is misguided. And I want to make a comment about the people, at least from what we've seen publicly, in terms of who's managing the restaurant in Virginia and who are the folks who are speaking out at the restaurant where Secretary Nielsen was. I see white folks. And, right, so there are folks who might otherwise fall into this middle America thing. And this is important, right? So white folks who are, you mentioned earlier, and I know it was in a slightly different context, but that it wasn't all about race and privilege. It kind of is. And in this context where we see white Americans stepping up and using their privilege, putting their bodies and their liberty on the line, it should harken us back to rabbis in Virginia who stood against when schools were there was trouble integrating them, to put it that way, or Protestants in Germany who stood against atrocities there. So that part of the role of what we call middle America, or that group of folks, it's notable, and it also it's more important in some ways than just a vote that's cast. And we started this by talking about whether or not this sort of disruption is effective. I think that's an important question, but I think a question that's equally important is it worth doing anyway? And you don't necessarily fall into this camp, but I certainly hear folks, and I think about Representative Maxine Waters, a black woman, right, a congresswoman who, right, for the president, right, to call her low IQ, she's not the first to get that tag, but the vitriol that is shouted at her is, in my, and I pay attention to social media, is undeniably worse than what's being shouted at the white folks who interrupted dinner. The level of hostility, the nastiness towards her is problematic because it really crystallizes that when you are a person of color often and you speak out against injustice and it makes other people uncomfortable, that for folks is more problematic than the injustice that you're talking about underneath. So it's why it's important to have a diversity of tactics, and while it's effective in some ways, it gives voice and it reminds people we have agency to not allow these things. I think that you and I had discussed earlier that I find myself wondering how many scholars of the past 100 years, how many moderate, right, ivory tower academics do we have to hear tell us that we're not at the beginning of seeing something like fascism, that we're several steps down the road? How many times are we going to hear this from thoughtful people who point to parallels before we recognize that if we're ever going to look back and ask, what did you do when the Hutus and Tutsis were having a conflict in Rwanda? What did you do when the Holocaust was happening, right? And Germany was enduring all that it did. This is our moment for that. And so for some of us, right, maybe the thing to say that we're doing is we voted. Maybe that's what you can do. But for others, to take away the agency that what they're doing is that when they see a person who is directly crafting policy that harms people, that they can tell their grandchild, what I did is I stood up to her. That has merit, and that's virtuous, and it's why I'm not going to condemn it. Whether or not the mayor getting booed out of the football stadium, no comment.
Last word.
Yeah, there's a lot there, a lot that I really don't agree with. You talk about Maxine Waters and what President Trump tweeted about her. The low IQ thing that he said was gratuitous and unnecessary, but you completely glossed over what he was responding to, where Maxine Waters got up in front of a bunch of people and told them, go harass anybody who works for the Trump administration. She said to them, make sure they get, and I'm quoting, no sleep, no peace. And you can't just gloss over that.
Well, no, that was important.
She's not right. You don't go to people's homes. That's not how this country. That's what she's telling them to do. She told them, go make sure they can't get any sleep. Go to their homes and yell at them so they can't get any sleep. And then she said, in the next sentence, make sure if you see them in a shopping mall or anywhere else, that you get together a crowd and tell them they're not welcome anywhere at any time. look, if you don't, this is not the same thing as the Jim Crow South. And you keep talking about they're doing these things that harm all these people. Well, there are just as many people in the United States of America who believe that the Trump administration is doing things that help people. If you don't like what it's doing, then get your stuff together and win the next election. But going to surround people's homes and yell at them, not only is it uncivil, and I don't mean that to sound sort of too precious, right? But it's a terrible political tactic, which is certain to drive on the fence voters towards Republicans, which is the last thing that Maxine Waters and her friends would want to have happen.
I've heard you say that right here that winning elections is not the end all and be all of action.
I mean, I'm nodding at part of what you said. We can talk about it offline. I think you terribly misrepresented. There's a very common phrase in activist circles in terms of no sleep, and it referencing you won't sleep easy, right? You'll know what's happening, and it not actually meaning anyone's coming into your bedroom. We can talk about that offline. Elections aren't the be-all and end-all, and I don't know if it's too radical for local mainstream media, but Audre Lorde taught us directly, like you cannot, right, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, right? So 1968 is when people that look like me were in some ways codified being able given the right to vote. So the idea that before 1968 we had no voice is laughable, right? There's ways to participate and make things happen. We have to, I just have to call you on it. I know you don't want to accept it this way, but coded or not, civility, calling for civility is calling for people to not stand up for their own rights. And you don't get to be in a position of power and dictate how those without the power assert their own power. That's not how any of this works, right? So as a practical matter, if it makes you uncomfortable, so be it. But civility
maybe
is
it's
saying,
maybe it's
don't
the
make me
definition of
uncomfortable.
civility. I am not saying don't make people uncomfortable.
No, I agree
I'm
with
all
you,
for a
the
protest.
definition of this. You're not.
I am.
As long as it doesn't make people too uncomfortable.
That's not true. I'm just not for harassing them at dinner when they're doing stuff with their family.
So
That's
now we
not
know,
protest.
So this is important
what you are then
now we know
doing
that
is
where you line up with the Democrats, and I know this doesn't happen super often, but nearly often enough maybe. But so there's this question of, because we see a lot of Democrats, our representative here who's facing a challenger goes down to the border and does a photo op. I'm sure she really cares. She's figuring out what's going on. But there's this question of, so for Democrats and elected officials, just how far does their concern for brown children go? And now we know the answer. It goes just as far as interrupting a white lady's dinner, right? It doesn't go past that. And so when there's an intersection and you say, you're all for protest, but that's where that line is. And your discomfort, right, is a sign of good things, right? I tend to believe, faithful optimist that I am, right, that folks are thinking folks and are going to think things through. I feel very confident that, if not in my lifetime, then my son's, that we who are taking these stands are going to come out on the right side of history. And that if folks are looking back and what they're focused on from this time is how uncomfortable, right? These women chose their jobs. They worked hard to ascend to be able to get them, but they made choices and put themselves in these positions, right? They're not fighting for the safety of their children. The idea of that being harassment, I think is kind of novel, and it's extra, really removes a lot of agency from them, right? Not only is it trolling to go to that Mexican spot, but these women made choices and career choices to do what they're doing, and they deserve to be called on it. And when politely worded, stern letters aren't cutting it, and voting alone isn't cutting it, then that is absolutely the time where discomfort and uncomfortable protest is appropriate.
Can you imagine the reaction by so much of this country, including almost all of the mainstream media, if this was being done by conservatives to members of the Obama administration, even if they weren't black, 5 years ago?
Do you mean when it did?
No.
So in terms of
now hold on a second. I'm not talking about terrible things that were said about the president.
Well, the
but what I am talking about is
the important distinction is that members of Mr. Obama's cabinet, who en masse disagreed about a lot of things with, were not responsible for these levels of tragedy.
That's still not the point.
That is the point. Because they don't just disagree with Sarah Sanders on economic policy.
Many Americans
would come unglued if this had happened to Obama cabinet officials. And
this hypothetical never works for me.
No, but I think that's pretty objectively true. People would have come unglued. And what you're saying is what they were doing is different than what the administration officials are doing now. Hey, that's a fair
what I'm
argument
saying
to make.
is and what?
Many Americans.
So people would be unglued and.
I think the question is there a common standard?
Clearly there's not. But complaining about double standards, whether it's media or anywhere else, like complaining about a puppy peeing on your rug, right? It's just what happens. If you don't like it, don't get a puppy. I still think that the bottom line is these things are generally settled by elections in this country. I'm not against protest.
What are
I am
these
against
things?
harassing.
What are these things that are settled?
Oh,
Did
every
these
issue,
things-
every issue you're talking about. The other thing I'd point out quickly is that you keep talking about the harm being done by the Trump administration, and then when we're talking about Obama just now, you say, well, there's no comparison.
No, that's not a distinction, because particularly when it comes to immigration, right? There's lots of problems there.
Okay, no, but I'm talking just broadly speaking, okay, in terms of broad public opinion, there were lots and lots of people in this country, including me, and I'm not a conservative and I'm not a Republican, who thought that what the Obama administration was doing in this country in a whole range of areas was incredibly harmful. And it never would have occurred to me to go harass somebody who works for Barack Obama because I don't like the administration's policies. Now, I might have, if I were, a protesting type of guy, and I did actually go to some Tea Party events back in the day and stuff like that, I would show up at places where politicians are doing their work. I wouldn't show up where they're eating dinner or in their homes, and I just think that my bottom line is, though, is I think it's going to backfire. Again, you keep saying that elections aren't the thing, and I get you believe that they're not the only thing, but they're the only thing that matters in the short term in Colorado right now. Primary tomorrow, elections in November. And I think this kind of, and I think this kind of,
what activists are doing in local areas.
I think it's going to backfire in a big way nationwide.
I think we're back where we started. We're going to leave it there. Ross, Elizabeth, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.